Abolition Working Group. I am happy to introduce this afternoon's program on avoiding Armageddon. We have with us today, what we will have in the program today are presentations by a couple of our allies, as well as a quick summary of what's happening with the Golden Rule peace boat cruise around the United States. The allies we have with us today are from Beyond the Bomb and No First Use Global Campaign. Beyond the Bomb is a people-powered campaign working to free our planet from nuclear violence. Campaign activists work to build power every day on the local, state, and national levels to prevent nuclear war and to put an end to the exploitative and morally bankrupt systems that support these horrific weapons. The leadership team of Beyond the Bomb comprises 7 young women, one of whom, Tristan Guyette, her pronouns are they and them, is with us today. Tristan is Beyond the Bomb's campaign director, managing both the digital and on-the-ground aspects of organizing against nuclear weapons. Prior to working in Non-Proliferation, Tristan worked on reproductive rights and voting access in Ohio, where they're based. Another of Beyond the Bomb's leaders, Yasmin Silva, is the campaign's liaison to the Veterans for Peace Nuclear Abolition Working Group. I strongly encourage you all to go to Beyond the Bomb's webpage and scroll down to their August 10th movement update on pale, stale, and male for some remarkable insights regarding startling fact that millennials see nuclear weapons today as the least important issue that affects the world. So this is obviously a situation that needs to be corrected. No First Use is a platform and a network of organizations, academics, and policymakers as civil society advocates working cooperatively for the adoption of no first use policies by the nuclear armed states. Veterans for Peace is one of the more than 65 participating organizations in the campaign, and Beyond the Bomb was one of the 9 co-founding organizations. No First Use Global is hosted by Prague Vision Institute for Sustainable Security. Alan Ware is a peace educator and nuclear disarmament campaigner from New Zealand who will be representing the campaign here today. He moved to New York in the early 1990s to lead the campaign to get the issue of the legality of nuclear weapons to the International Court of Justice, and then to follow up the case after the court's historic decision in 1996. In 2009, Alan was awarded the Right Livelihood Laureate for his effective and creative advocacy and initiative over 2 decades to further peace education and rid the world of nuclear weapons. Now, a decade later, he comes to us as a spokesperson for the No First Use Global Campaign. Among other roles, he has been the global coordinator for Parliamentarians for Nuclear Proliferation and Disarmament since it was founded in 2002. Before we go any further, I want to thank the organizers of the convention and especially the incredible staff that does this work for us. It does miracle what they can do in presenting this online. We also want to acknowledge that those of us here in the United States are all occupying indigenous territories. Here in Santa Fe, where I am, this was Tewa country, and Santa Fe itself was known as Ogapoge to the indigenous people here. But I'm now going to go on to introduce you to the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Group. And I'll take a moment to share my screen to introduce you to the statement of purpose of the weapons group. Just have to get this screen show going. The Nuclear Weapons Nuclear Weapons Abolition Working Group is, in a sense, the working group which is implementing the third element of the Veterans for Peace Statement of Purpose, which is to end the arms race and to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. We've adopted I apologize. We have a 9-point statement of purpose, which is intended to organize our thoughts and our actions as we move forward towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And the first step on that statement of purpose is to adopt to work to get the US government to adopt a no first use policy. And to make that policy credible by publicly decommissioning US ICBMs, since ICBMs are an inherently first use weapon. Policy statements are a good first step, but obviously for them to be effective, there has to be steps taken to make clear that the policy is really more than simply a statement of words. There's currently a piece of legislation in the US Congress introduced by Senator Markey of Massachusetts and Representative Liu. And as you might gather, I had a bunch of pieces of paper here, which I'm fumbling to find. Very frustrating. But there, I believe the House of Representatives number is 669 on Representative Liu's legislation. And it would simply require that we make a statement that is the policy of the United States, not to resort to first use of nuclear weapons without a declaration of war by the Congress. One of the problems in having these online pieces is that the menu is obscuring part of what's on my screen. You can probably all see all of it, but I can't. Okay, the second statement in the statement of purpose is to reduce the probability of accidental, unauthorized, or unintentional nuclear exchange by taking US nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert and storing warheads separately from delivery systems. Launches during the Cuban Missile Crisis were narrowly averted. Thankfully, miraculously, officers intervened to stop the launch of nuclear weapons in Soviet submarines. There have been other cases of the accidental weapon. And that's likely to happen as long as we have our weapons on hair trigger alert. There are some members of the working group who feel that this should be the first item on the statement of purpose. It's certainly on a par with taking the step of no first use, but it's something that is going to be hard to demonstrate unless we can come up with a system of inspections, mutual inspections, to see that the weapons warheads are stored separately from the delivery systems. Third is to redirect the entire budget, which has been put forth, plans to replace the entire US arsenal with enhanced weapons at a cost of more than 1.7 trillion over the next 30 years. Somehow this button keeps getting pushed. And we want to see that money redirected redirect the money saved into environmentally and socially sound programs, including the accelerated cleanup of highly toxic and radioactive waste left during 8 decades of the nuclear cycle. We want to end the sole unchecked authority of any president of his or her delegates and their delegates to launch nuclear attack and require congressional approval of any use of nuclear weapons. And in fact, the legislation that's been put forth by Senator Markey and Representative Liu both require congressional approval for the use of nuclear weapons. And you may know that there's evidence that the ability to launch nuclear weapons has been delegated well beyond the presidential level. So it's important that this be restricted. Sixth, we want our government to comply with obligations under the 1968 Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons by actively pursuing a verifiable agreement among nuclear-armed states to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. That 1968 weapons treaty, all the non-nuclear states agreed not to pursue, or at least all the signatories agreed not to pursue the development of nuclear weapons, provided that the nuclear states would take actions to reduce their arsenals and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. As you know, none of the nuclear weapon states have done that, probably in large part because the United States has failed to take leadership in that direction. So it's important that we press the government to obey its treaty laws, since the treaties are supposed to be the highest law in the land. The Republic of the Marshall Islands has actually sued the 9 nuclear-armed nations to try to get them to comply with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Once we make progress on complying with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, then we can move ahead with more energy to get the United States to become a signatory to the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That treaty has become part of international law as of January 22nd of this year, when the 50th nation actually ratified the treaty. In the original UN discussions, 122 nations signed on to the treaty. Actually, 89 have become signatories and 55 have ratified it, so that it is now in effect. And you can use the treaty as a tool for moving along all of these steps in the statement of purpose. Number 8 was to phase out nuclear energy, stop producing depleted uranium weapons, stop uranium mining and processing and enrichment. All of these steps create victims of nuclear development. The nuclear power industry cannot survive economically on its own without significant subsidies from governments, and all of the steps create victims of radiation poisoning, and all of the steps create waste, which we still don't know how to deal with all these years into the nuclear era. And we've got to clean up all that waste. So that's part of our statement of purpose, is to take political actions to get these waste sites cleared up. As you can see, 15,000 abandoned uranium mine sites. There are the processing plants as well. The map shows how the victims of radioactivity are spread out across the country. And finally, fund healthcare and compensation for the victims of radiation. So it's an ambitious program that the working group has undertaken. We count on working with many allies to do this. We have established a liaison relationship with Beyond the Bomb. We are a participating organization in the No First Use Global Campaign. And we invite you to join us. If you can become a member of the working group by contacting Helen Jacquard, who will be coming back after the other 2 presentations to tell us about the Golden Rule. You can follow us on Facebook. You can join our meetings, as we meet every 2 weeks. On August 9th, Bruce Gagnon did a terrific presentation on weapons in space, as well as other impacts of the 5G developments. And then, as you can see, on August 23rd, we will have a speaker from the Marshall Islands, and September 13th, our time, Akino Miyagi from Okinawa, Japan, a naturalist in Okinawa, who's going to tell us about the impact of the US installations and activities on Okinawa. So please join us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tristan Guyette from Beyond the Bomb. Thank you so much for joining us, Tristan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I think I need you to stop sharing in order for me to share my slide.
Oh, yes, you do.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here and for having me. I really appreciate y'all choosing. I heard there's another great panel going on right now, so I really appreciate you being here with us. So as Ken said, I am the campaigns director for Beyond the Bomb. And we are a people-powered movement working to end the threat of nuclear war, which is a lofty goal, right? But I have put up my contact information here. I would absolutely love if anyone would like to get in touch after this to discuss strategy, talk nuclear weapons, whatever you want to do. My email is tristan@beyondthebomb.org. You can find me and Beyond the Bomb on Twitter as well. So I'm going to jump right in to talking about Beyond the Bomb's vision, which I think really does align with a lot of your visions, hopefully, and kind of the work that we're doing, until I can get into how y'all can get involved and some of our philosophy around this organizing. So our vision, where we derive our name from, is a planet that has moved beyond the bomb. So for us, that mimics a lot of, the working group statements. It includes communities that are impacted by nuclear weapons receiving and getting justice, or receiving recognition and justice. We're also looking forward to a future where we're prioritizing community needs and human needs over endless war and weapons of mass destruction. And I think, to me, one of the really important points is that the interests of citizens come before the interests of corporations like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, because I think they are driving a lot of this nuclear modernization that we're trying to kill. So all of these reasons are why we at Beyond the Bomb talk about nuclear weapons like they're issue zero, and we organize around them as if they're issue zero. And what I mean by that is that if you care about the climate, if you care about Indigenous rights, if you care about ending endless war and militarization, you should care about nuclear weapons, because they are at the core of so many of these other issues. Prior to coming to Beyond the Bomb, I had not worked on nuclear weapons at all, but I had worked on reproductive justice. I had worked on voting access and equity. And I saw those connections there. And that's what we focus on when we organize around these issues, because nuclear weapons, if they're not something that has been a part of your life, they seem so far off and they seem so hard to change. And we just don't believe that. So this is our theory of change here at Beyond the Bomb. And it's, if we mobilize grassroots activists, if we have so many people talking to their representatives, demanding change on these issues, they won't be able to ignore us. So that's people, that's high schoolers, that's folks like you who are veterans, it is marginalized community members. We need everyone here, because we need to be a voice that are so loud that they can't ignore us anymore. So like I've mentioned, we organize around our values, things like putting communities before profits and justice, but we really focus on hope, right? Because nuclear weapons they're terrifying. They can end the world tomorrow, but terrifying people doesn't always drive them to action. So we try and focus on the future that we're trying to build. And all of the work that we do focuses on moving people up what we call the pyramid of engagement. And depending on what you're viewing this on, that might be kind of small, so I blew it up for you. You may have heard this called like the ladder of engagement, or there's a bunch of different names for it. But the basic idea is that we can't have a strong movement that's accomplishing really awesome things unless we have a strong base of people who understand that this is an issue. And with nuclear weapons, like we've mentioned, these issues aren't as obvious as they are things like climate change, where they're talked about a lot. If there are people that I talk to every day who don't believe me that the president has sole authority over launching a nuclear weapon, and I have to kind of laugh, because in that case, they're just paying me to do nothing, and I've gamed the system. But I think education is the most important part of our work. And ideally, when we are educating people about this issue, we're giving them an opportunity right away to take action to change that, whether that's just signing up for an email list, taking a petition. The goal is always to push people to identify with this issue more and more, so that they see it as something that they want to work on and that they want to continue to work on ending, until people are at the point where they're leading this work. They're people like Ken and Helen, who are working on the working groups for BFP, and Alan. And I think when we keep that in mind, and we keep the idea of really equipping and encouraging people to lead this work instead of wanting to hold on to it for ourselves, that's where, at least at Beyond the Bomb, we have seen some really amazing creative campaigns. Bearing in mind how much time I have, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the issues that we do work on before I talk about some of the campaign actions that we do and some of the ways we'd love to work with y'all. But our issues are very similar to the working groups here. We are focused on passing no first use. And that's not because we think that that's like the last step, right? For us, it's a first step in the right direction, and it starts changing the conversation. So we can start talking more about like, okay, why are our weapons on hair trigger alert? Why are we spending so much money on them? Because right now, when you walk into even like Democratic or a Democratic office, sometimes when you say you want to get rid of nuclear weapons, they immediately tune you out, which is very frustrating. But we are working on kind of taking those small steps towards pushing us towards a better world. Obviously, spending is a huge part of that. We are prioritizing endless war and nuclear weapons over obviously things like pandemic response, but so many other things. So we do a lot of work around the budget, pressuring our representatives, and also working with like media and things like that to call attention to where all of this money is going. And then lastly, we do a lot of work on uplifting the voices of impacted communities and working for justice. So I see Garth in the Q&A mentioned atomic veterans, and we do work on both uplifting those voices and working on passing and extending radiation compensation. So if you check out our website, I have a little picture of it, of the blog post coming up here, but we ran a really great interview with an atomic veteran on Memorial Day that I would encourage y'all to check out. So some of the ways that we do this work, especially before the pandemic, and we could do more in-person things like canvassing and petitioning, but we do lobby visits. We do a lot of community building work too. In that lower left-hand corner, one of our volunteers had a yellow cake study break at her school every week, kind of a play on yellow cake uranium. And it was just a time for everybody to get together. If there was an action for them to take, it was like available, but it was more about spending time together and building community. And we always love direct action and protests at Beyond the Bomb. So all of the things that we do kind of feed into that pyramid of engagement and working towards being so loud that our representatives can't ignore us, right? So we do a lot of education. We do lobby our representatives through, writing letters, phone calls, and visits. And as I've said, we really need a huge diversity of people working on this issue, but I think a space for veterans to be really involved in this work is y'all have such credibility going into these offices talking about foreign policy issues and national security issues. And so, if we can get a high school student from Beyond the Bomb and a veteran from Veterans for Peace and, maybe somebody else in the room, it's hard to say that the constituency at large is not concerned about this. It's not just one small group of people, it's a whole bunch of people willing to come to your office and tell you that you need to put some checks and balances on this system. And like I've mentioned, direct action. So we just launched a little magazine that our volunteers are contributing to. We love a protest and a banner drop and a march, just really trying all of the avenues that we can to bring attention to this issue. So before I wrap up here, just some of the issues that we're working on. I feel like I've covered some of these already. No first use is a big one for us. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, if you are not familiar with it, it does not cover everyone who is impacted by nuclear weapons. So in addition to it sunsetting next year, we are working to get that renewed and expanded so it actually covers all of the victims and survivors. The budget, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a yearly fight, but with President Biden's nuclear posture review coming up, we have a really interesting opportunity to shape the budget over the next few years. Congress has already, for example, said that when it comes to funding the sea-launched cruise missiles, they're going to approve the funding, but not if the nuclear posture review does not say that they are necessary. So we can put pressure on Congress, we can put pressure on Biden, but what I think we really need to do is put pressure on our friends and family to start caring about this issue as much as we do, because we need a whole chorus out there. It can't just be those of us in this room, although I am so thankful that you are here. So before I wrap up, if you would like to get involved with Beyond the Bomb or the working group, there are so many things you can do no matter the amount of time that you have. Some of them are really simple. It's like you can go to our website and just fill in your address and click a button and it'll send a pre-written letter off to your representative. So if you have time to be here, I think you have time to do that. But if you want to get more involved, as I've said, you have so much credibility on this topic as a veteran. You can do things like writing op-eds and articles. talk to your representatives, get them on the phone, and really just stay involved in stuff like this. So here's my contact information one more time. I will drop the link to the slides in the chat, and I can send those to Ken and Colleen as well to get out to you afterwards. But I will go ahead and pass it back to Ken until we're done here.
Thank you, Tristan. That was terrific. I'm going to ask you one question kind of out of order because I know you have a fellowship program at Beyond the Bomb. I'd love to have you tell folks a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started this program. We are in our 6th cohort, and it started off as a 4-month program. It's now 6 months, but you can come work for us a couple of hours a week. Over those 6 months, we pay out a stipend of $1,000. But the whole point is to really come together as a community, discuss what we want to change in the nuclear weapons space, and also equip all of these people in the fellowship with the tools to be like really kick butt digital organizers and go out and get things done just from day one. So it's been so cool seeing the projects that they come up with. If you look at our blog, we have so many interesting blog posts. We've had at least one veteran in the program, and there's no age or education minimums or maximums. It's really open to everyone. We try and make it as accessible as possible. So the next round for that will open up in November, and the best way to find out about that is to sign up for our mailing list.
Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Alan to tell us more about the No First Use Global Campaign.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm just getting the slideshow started. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be invited to join Veterans for Peace Assembly conference. I haven't yet got to one in the past, but I've been meaning to try and get to one. And so it's wonderful to be able to join you this time, even though it's a remote conference. So I'm really impressed with the work that Veterans for Peace is doing. And, in a sense, having come from, the military, veterans understand so much better, I think, than many of us, what war is, what it means and why we need to prevent it. And so it's really important to build, as you said, Ken, the alliances between veterans and some of the other organizations that are working, because we can learn a lot from you, from your experiences. And then some of us come with other experiences and information that can helpfully, inform and help and engage veterans. You've asked me to talk about no first use, but I'm actually going to broaden my presentation a little bit, because no first use policies by themselves, while important, don't do much unless they're part of a broader strategy for nuclear abolition. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about international law and war, a little bit about the nuclear weapons money, because that's part of what's prompting the nuclear arms race, is the work of the corporations, and to push for the continued spending on nuclear weapons, and where no first use fits into that. My background is I'm engaged with parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, the World Future Council, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, and the grassroots global network Abolition 2000 to eliminate nuclear weapons. So the 5 topics that I'll talk about, and I'll put no first use global right in the middle, is firstly talk a bit about nuclear weapons in the law, then the importance about engaging with legislators, then no first use itself, how it relates also to nuclear weapons budgets, and then finally follow up on, I think, what Tristan was saying, the importance of engaging with youth. The laws, this to me is very, very important, and it's something which military people know very well, because you're taught it. If you're in a proper army or a proper military force, you are taught the laws of warfare. And there are two key aspects to the laws of warfare. One is the law of peace and security, or jus ad bellum. That's, when it's allowable to actually use force. And there is quite strong international law preventing war. The UN Charter Article 2 prohibits in general the threat or use of force. UN Charter Article 33 requires UN members to settle disputes by peaceful means. Now, there's an exception to this Article 51, which provides the possibility of the threat or use of force in response to an armed aggression, but that includes a lot of principles or caveats that are laid on there. Those are that any use of force, even in that circumstance, needs to have a proper cause, needs to be last resort. Other means of resolving that issue need to be tried first, needs to be under proper authority, possessing the right intention and having a reasonable chance of success. Then if you're in wartime and armed conflict, there is also law. This is international humanitarian law, or jus in bello. And there are 5 key principles in there. Proportionality. In armed conflict, you can't respond with a military attack that is way out of proportion to what preceded that or what prompted you to have that attack. Distinction is another important one. That is that in armed conflict, you can have military targets, but you can't target civilians, or you can't use military methods that might fail to distinguish between military targets and cause indiscriminate harm. Also, humanity, you can't use methods of warfare that cause inhumane or unnecessary suffering to combatants. You can't impact neutral territories, and you can't use the environment as a method of war. You need to protect the environment. So these are all principles of warfare. Now, why are they important? Because they relate to nuclear weapons. And we saw that when the International Court of Justice in 1996 applied these laws of warfare to the issue of nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned, these laws are binding on all countries. This is customary law that's binding universally. And the International Court of Justice affirmed, after applying this law, that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal, and that there is an obligation to achieve complete nuclear disarmament. Now, I raise this because not enough people know about this. Not enough people understand that there is this law in the world, that this law is binding on countries, that militaries are supposed to abide by this law. Most of the time, the formal militaries do. So this law is actually very, very important. I also point to the affirmation from the International Court of Justice about the impact of nuclear weapons, which is what brought them to this decision that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal. And that is, they could see from the evidence from the nuclear testing primarily that the destructive power of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in either space or time. That is, it violates neutral territories, but it also violates the rights of future generations because of the transgenerational impact, the long lasting of it. So we have a body of law that already makes nuclear weapons illegal. Brings me to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because there's a little confusion, I think, about this treaty. One of the positive things about the treaty is it provides for those states who are parties to it, a more comprehensive prohibition on nuclear weapons against possession, development, aiding and abetting, etc. But the problem with the treaty is it's only binding on countries who join. It's a treaty, and that's what treaties do. None of the nuclear armed or allied countries have joined. And the nuclear armed states and their allies are using this as an excuse. They say, we're not signing the treaty, so we're not bound by it. And it's very important for us to go back to the customary law that was already established that's binding on everybody, that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is illegal, and there's a legal obligation to eliminate those weapons under customary law. So we can't let them use the fact that they haven't signed on to this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons as an excuse. So I mentioned this, but it's actually strengthened even further by human rights law. This is another body of law. It's not the laws of warfare, it's human rights law. And of course, a pioneer of that was Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped bring about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UN General Assembly resolution, that she was instrumental, and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which followed up on implementation of that. The right to life is enshrined in both of those. And in 2018, the UN Human Rights Committee affirmed that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with respect for the right to life and may amount to a crime under international law, and that countries have an obligation under human rights law to address the human impact of nuclear weapons testing and production and achieve the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. So we have incredibly strong international law now against nuclear weapons that the nuclear-armed and allied states can't escape from. And I mentioned, that military personnel have a role to play in this because military personnel are trained in abiding by the laws of warfare in military operations. Soldiers are required to adhere to the laws of warfare, even when superior officers are failing to do so. So here, I think it's really important that veterans speak out on this issue. You have credibility, veterans, as having operated under the laws of warfare when you're in service. And so you have an opportunity now out of service to speak about that and to say how important laws of warfare are, that they apply to nuclear weapons, that they are binding on everyone, and that they provide for the illegality of nuclear weapons. That's a very, very strong argument and a very valuable one. And people pay attention to that when veterans are saying this, because you've had that experience of operating under them. So I mention that because that's part of the context moving to no first use. Because I said no first use is not something in a vacuum. It's based on law against the use of nuclear weapons. But just before I get to that, I also want to mention that the importance of working with legislators, because veterans can talk about, what are the laws of warfare as lawyers can, and civil society people. We can all have a voice on that. But to implement it, we do need to work with legislators. They are the ones who have a responsibility to implement this, to adopt, the legislation to ensure that this is implemented. So here we have a global network of legislators, parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmed, which is trying to build a cooperation between legislators in different parliaments and legislators around the world. In the US, where the organization's led by Senator Ed Markey. We've already heard a couple of initiatives from Ed Markey. But one of the resources which I want to point out, because this is useful not just for legislators, but for everybody else, is a handbook which was just produced late last year. So it's quite current. It talks about disarmament in the context of the pandemic, disarmament and sustainable development, disarmament and peace in cyberspace and relating to cyber attacks, disarmament in space, as well as nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, inhumane weapons. It's assuring our common future, and PNND produced this in cooperation with the United Nations. It's available, online, so you can read it on your cell phone, on your tablet, on your laptop, and it's got the different sections about disarmament. What are some of the UN treaties, international law, and what are some of the positive examples of policies around the world? I take on what Tristan said. We need to look at the positive, what we want to achieve, not just the negative, what we're opposed. And when you see there are some very good policies that have been adopted by various governments, by various parliaments, that helps strengthen our resolve to take forward those in our own country, wherever we are. So I recommend this. The website is there for the handbook online in order to get background on disarmament issues, effective policies, and what legislators are doing. Which now brings me to no first use. I apologize, it took me a little while to get there, but I wanted to put it in this broader context, because no first use is a global campaign, not just to prevent a nuclear war by pulling countries back from their readiness to use nuclear weapons, but also to pave the way for nuclear disarmament. Because if countries still hold on to policies to use nuclear weapons in a whole range of circumstances, to deal with other weapons of mass destruction, to deal with conventional weapons, to deal with even cyber attacks, then they're not going to move to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons because sorry, we need them for all these different purposes. If they can get to no first use or sole purpose, it means the only reason they've got the nuclear weapons is to deter the other nuclear weapons. So if the other countries with nuclear weapons join them in a process for eliminating nuclear weapons, there's no reason to hold on to them. That logic explains why the countries, the nuclear armed states which currently have no first use policies, China and India, are also the countries that are most supportive of nuclear abolition at the United Nations, not just steps to disarmament, but an actual nuclear weapons convention. China and India have not only voted on this, they've actually put forward ideas about taking it forward. So no first use is, not, as I said, not just to prevent a nuclear war, but help pave the way to move towards nuclear disarmament. So the platform, No First Use Global, and we're very thankful to Veterans for Peace who are becoming a participating organisation, provides information, actions, meetings, opportunities for cooperation to develop these policies. We did a recent open letter to Presidents Biden and Putin just before their summit, and it was endorsed by over 1,200 political, military, the leaders, parliamentarians, academics, religious leaders, etc. And no first use can happen in a range of different ways. It could be a unilateral declaration or policy development, like China has done and India has done. It could be a bilateral one. In fact, Russia and China have actually got a bilateral no first use policy. Maybe Russia and the United States could do one as part of the strategic dialogue, or it could be moving towards a more global no first use. So there's a range of different ways. And our catchphrase here is don't even think about starting a nuclear war. And as you see, this is it comes from the old New York parking sign, don't even think about parking here. And we've parked the sign in front of the US Embassy in Prague. And this is a social media action that's moving at the moment. I'm going to wrap up really quickly because I know I'm taking a bit of time. It's also linked to what Ken has already raised beforehand, and Tristan, is the nuclear arms race is being fueled by the corporations and their political power. How do we address those? And part of that is campaigns to stop the investments, cut the nuclear weapons budgets, and to reinvest in better things. And so Move the Nuclear Weapons Money is a platform which does that. It's got a whole lot of different ways that people can stop investing in nuclear weapons, whether you're an individual investor, whether you're a religious organization, whether you're a university, a pension fund, or even governments. We've got 4 governments that have adopted nuclear weapons divestment policies, including my own, New Zealand, so that none of our government funds neither the government bank, Kiwi Bank, will invest in nuclear weapons anymore. So it's a movement that's catching on. And I think we've already heard a couple of the legislative initiatives. Senator Markey has put forward this ICBM Act, Invest in Cures Before Missiles, to demonstrate you could be using this money instead for the pandemic. And their social media can also engaged. Here we have a couple of people, the Commander Robert Forsyth, a former nuclear submarine commander from the UK, has done a statement with a picture. Leah Bolger, who's also a member of Veterans for Peace, has done a statement, and we use these to sort of promote this idea of moving the nuclear weapons money on social media. And finally, engaging with youth. It's fantastic that Veterans for Peace is looking at engaging in youth. We're really inspired by the Youth Fusion, the Global Youth Network for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a youth network for Abolition 2000, and some of the initiatives that they've been doing. So I was just laying out some of those here for you. They are doing a lot on intergenerational dialogue. They're telling stories with a new interactive animated formats. They're doing social media actions. One's coming up on August 29th, the International Day Against Nuclear Tests, which Youth Fusion is doing with the United Nations. Step Up for Disarmament. So there's a range of ways that you can engage with youth. Beyond the Bomb, of course, is youth-led as well, and we cooperate a lot, and Youth Fusion cooperates a lot with Beyond the Bomb. So it's not either or, one or the other. Youth Fusion is global, Beyond the Bomb is primarily the US. So you're welcome to sort of join those. And there are the key websites for those initiatives that I've been talking about, which you can go to. I forgot to do what Tristan did, which is put my email address on my PowerPoint presentation. So I'll put it in the chat session just after this. And thank you again very much for this opportunity to talk about no first use and put it in the broader context of a strategy for global nuclear abolition. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was terrific. And I'm very, very happy to have you expand it well beyond no first use, because certainly our issues all go well beyond no first use. And with that, I'll turn it over to Helen Jacquard to update us on the Golden Rule.
Hi, and thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Okay. So this presentation is about the Golden Rule sailboat. And what we have done in the past will be very brief because most of you are already familiar with it, and our plans for the future and what we need to make those plans happen. And again, the Golden Rule was the first of Veterans for Peace's efforts to implement the statement of purpose part that says to end the arms race and to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. In 1958, the US had, by the end of 1958, dropped 67 nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands, and activists were trying to get rid of that testing program, and a brave set of Quakers bought the Golden Rule and sailed her towards the Marshall Islands to try to get in the way of nuclear bomb tests. So they made 2 attempts. On the second one, they made out of Los Angeles. They made it to Honolulu, where the crew was arrested and put in jail for 60 days for attempting to go to the nuclear testing zone in the Marshall Islands. And ultimately, they did not end up going beyond Honolulu. They sold the boat at that time, and nobody really heard from her again until she showed up in Humboldt Bay in Northern California, a derelict boat without sails, without an engine. She was just floating around there. And she ended up being tied to a dock, and a gale came along and bashed her against that dock until she developed this huge hole in her side and she sank. Veterans for Peace and Quakers in the Humboldt Bay, Northern California area decided to restore the Golden Rule, and it took 5 years of hard work, many people showing up every day for 5 years to put this boat back together again. And in June of 2015, we relaunched the Golden Rules back into the waters of Northern California. They did this because of the things that are happening now in the world, such as the increased threat of nuclear war, the nuclear power meltdowns, the increased amount of nuclear waste that we don't know what to do with, and the amount of money that's put into the nuclear industry, as well as the harm that's already been done and is continuing with uranium mines, mills, transporting radioactive materials, processing those materials into both weapons and power plants. And these are contaminating the environment today and causing people cancers and birth defects and other health problems. If you want to hear more about the history of the Golden Rule, there's a movie on our website, which is vfpgoldenrule.org. There's both a 10-minute and a 25-minute version of Making Waves, Rebirth of the Golden Rule. There's another movie in the making that concentrates on the voyage from Hawaii back to California. And on that boat was a filmmaker whose production company and another production company are self-funding a new movie about the Golden Rule. In 2015, the first voyage, we went down to San Diego for the Veterans for Peace National Convention and made 10 ports of call on the way back to talk about the mission of the Golden Rule and its history. 2016 saw increased action when we went to the Pacific Northwest. I gave over 25 educational presentations. We did nonviolent direct actions, and we're always trying to reach beyond the choir. Now, certainly we need to talk to peace and justice organizations and anti-nuclear organizations about what we're doing, but as a boat, we can be in wooden boat shows. We participated in the Indigenous canoe voyage. We give boat tours. We take people sailing, and we flyer at public events. We do our best to get beyond the choir so that the general public will be aware of the dangers of the nuclear industry and what they can do to help. And that will help push the legislators even further to take action. From 2017 through 2019, we spent a lot of time in Southern California. So we took out of Northern California, sailed down to San Diego, multiple times. We even stopped and visited the boat that took over in Honolulu and did go to the Marshall Islands in 1958. That boat's the Phoenix of Hiroshima, and she sank in the waters of Northern California the same year that Golden Rule sank in another location. And we took the baton from her, she took the baton from us in 1958. Now that she has sank and will no longer be considered for raising and restoring, we've taken the baton back and now represent both boats. We also did a peace action and sailing camp in San Francisco Bay with a group from Tucson. And that was a very successful week of action and education. So here's some of our fantastic sailors that have been with us. Tom Trout, who's since died, a member of Veterans for Peace, Akiko, and my partner, Jerry Condon, who's a very important part of this project and is with me side by side every step of the way. And then we have a crew picture here that includes Ann Wright, who went for one long overnight voyage with us. We present to students of all ages. Here's a group of kindergartners that were involved with drawing pictures after they heard a presentation about the Golden Rule. So we give presentations to local governments. We take people sailing. We participate in local events, especially Hiroshima and Nagasaki events. We supported this fantastic handmade canoe when we were in the Pacific Northwest, and we've been in wooden boat shows and participated in races, although Golden Rule is an ocean-going vessel, not a race boat. And here's one of our Fleet Week actions. We've been in 5 different Fleet Weeks, all the way from Seattle to San Diego to Honolulu. In 2017, when Trump became president and started threatening North Korea, and they in turn threatened us, we planned to go to Hawaii, the Marshall Islands, Guam, Okinawa, and Japan to protest against the increased threat of nuclear war. So we made it back to Honolulu in July of 2019. And during our almost 2 years that we were there, we put on over 110 presentations, reached over 2,200 people directly, not to mention the thousands of people that saw us on TV, radio, and in the newspapers. We get great coverage wherever we go. People put, big pictures of the Golden Rule on the front page of the newspaper, as did the biggest newspaper in Hawaii, and all the smaller newspapers as well. So people love to see us, and they love to hear about what we're doing. So we attend religious organizations of all kinds. We present at Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemorations, talk with students, do potlucks, present at libraries, Rotary clubs, yacht clubs, and of course, numerous other kinds of clubs and ways that we can give presentations. We're now talking about perhaps expanding into maybe, county fairs and things like that. Why not? Okay. Wherever we go, we try to understand the local issues involved. And when we were in Hawaii, the biggest issue that Veterans for Peace is working on, and therefore that we were involved with, was militarism. And the military has basically taken over Hawaii. They destroyed an island entirely, Kaho'olawe, which is now being cleaned up. But they're going to have decades of work cleaning up all the unexploded ordnance that's still there. There's a huge live fire training range on the big island of Hawaii, Pohakuloa. There's other live fire training ranges there. There's the Pacific Missile Test Range, where they send up missiles to destroy other missiles that are carrying supposedly nuclear weapons. As in the state of Washington, where I am right now, they have declared that they have the right to invade all of the beaches and the parks in Hawaii and elsewhere, so that they can practice their military exercises in a whole variety of scenarios. There's depleted uranium weapons been acknowledged in Hawaii. There's contamination from the biggest fuel storage depot in the United States arsenal that supplies the entire Pacific Fleet with fuel. There's the missile defense system and a new one planned on either Oahu or Kauai. And the military actually says they own 20 to 25% of the land in Hawaii. So we're protesting against all of that, as well as the RIMPAC exercises that are held every 2 years. We were able to be out there during RIMPAC to protest against this giant gathering of naval militaries in the world. We joined up with another sailing vessel, the Hanekonomoku, which is sailed by 9th graders in an indigenous cultural program that they have. And then we gathered multiple times at this park right in Honolulu. This one was for the Castle Bravo test, March 1st, 1954, which contaminated a lot of the Marshall Islands, as well as the Japanese fishing boat. Everywhere we go, we get welcomed by the state or local governments. And we had a huge victory for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and back from the Brink campaigns, when the Honolulu City and County Council passed a resolution urging the federal government to follow all of those campaigns, as well as to welcome the Golden Rule. Finally, during the month of May, the Golden Rule took a 30-day voyage from Honolulu to San Francisco Bay. It was a very difficult voyage, and the crew arrived safely and ready to celebrate that they no longer had to be at sea. It was a wonderful event that they came back to San Francisco. Everyone, including the boat, arrived safely. Then we needed to sail across the bay. So this was taken during the sail from Sausalito, where they first arrived, to where we are right now, the Berkeley Marina. Our plans for the future, our big plan is to sail what's called the Great Loop. We would truck Golden Rule from somewhere on the West Coast to Minneapolis, St. Paul. The yellow line shows us going from Minneapolis all the way down the entire Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. Then we go around Florida up and visit all of the big cities on the East Coast, as far north as the birthplace of the Veterans for Peace, which is Portland, Maine. Then come back to New York, go up the Hudson River and through the Erie Canal, go all around the Great Lakes, and then back down the center of the country, starting at the Illinois River in Chicago, going through the Mississippi River, Ohio River, and finally down the Tennessee and Tombigbee rivers back down to the Gulf of Mexico. This trip will take more than 15 months, and we will visit over 100 different towns and cities. Therefore, we'll be giving 200 or 300 presentations along the way. And when we're finished, we'll probably sail back through the Panama Canal and stop to thank the countries that have signed the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons Treaty, as well as the countries that already belong to the first nuclear weapons-free zone in the world. However, although we were going to start that journey in September this year, we decided as the Golden Rule Committee that we don't have the infrastructure, the money, the staff, the volunteers organized to make the best of this opportunity, and have decided that it would be best to delay this trip. Now, the trip needs to start at a certain time of year, which is September, because you want to be in the northern states during the summer and the southern states during the winter and after hurricane season. So the yearly cycle is dictated by the climate, the weather, and therefore it makes sense to postpone this trip for exactly a year beyond what we originally planned. And so if we're going to postpone, that gives us an opportunity to put together what we really need in order to do a really great job and make the best of this boat and this organization that we have behind us by putting the effort in to define what roles and responsibilities are really needed to do this right. So we need to pay more people. We need a project manager, a volunteer coordinator. We're going to need a series of captains. We need a boat and crew manager, and we need somebody that's devoted to fundraising, as well as all the volunteers that are needed to make this happen, including crew, shore support, event managers and organizers, web and social media people, and graphic designers and newsletter editors. In order to make room for the people that can do the best job at this, I will slowly be stepping back a bit and turning over some of my responsibilities to other people. And so, yes, we're going to need somebody to step into the role of project manager. I will do the best I can at making sure that this transition is smooth and that all of the responsibilities are taken care of as we build our organization into something that can do a great job at doing the Great Loop and beyond. So contact us. Here's our contact information, and I'll put this in the chat as well. But we are looking forward to working with you both while we're on the West Coast, as well as while we're doing the Great Loop and beyond. So we're looking to you to help us to have a nuclear-free world and a peaceful, sustainable future. So help us make this hope a reality of getting rid of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That was a great presentation, and thank you for the terrific job that you've done as project manager for the last several years. It's quite an achievement. And with that, I will open it to questions. As I may have indicated earlier, I'm not a person who can read chats while dealing with a presentation. I also am very happy that the other presenters are much more facile using PowerPoint slides on Zoom than I am. Wonderful job you all did. So I'm wondering if perhaps Colleen collected some questions along the way on the chat, because I couldn't see them as they went by.
It didn't seem like people were asking a lot of questions, just giving a lot of affirmations to y'all.
Garth Selfield entered a question mark after atomic veterans. I presume he's asking about whether our statement of purpose embraces compensation for atomic veterans. It certainly does. A large subset of atomic veterans have been covered in previous legislation, but not all. And certainly if you extend atomic veterans to mean not only military veterans, but downwinders and others, Tristan mentioned the RECA Act to compensate victims of radiation, and that's up for renewal in 2022. And there's a lot of work being put into expanding the coverage, particularly here in New Mexico, which somehow got left out of the original RECA Act, in spite of the fact that the first nuclear victims were here in New Mexico. There are a few atomic veterans in Veterans for Peace, and Lincoln Groffs, a member of Veterans for Peace, is the president of the Atomic Veterans Association. Garth, if you had other things you wanted to include in that question, you can either put them in the Q&A or add them in the chat now.
I have a good question maybe for Tristan. You know, as someone who has been in the anti-war movement for the last 25 years, it's been really interesting to me how much in the last 5 years there's been a lot of involvement with young folks around nuclear weapon abolition, because I think for a lot of folks of my generation and below, didn't really see nuclear weapons as an issue today. And I've been really heartened, especially on social media, because I do a lot of the social media for Veterans for Peace, to see the efforts of Beyond the Bomb and a number of other organizations that have sort of sprung up to do actual outreach and education and organizing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, Tristan.
Yeah, I can certainly talk a little bit more about it. I think, so interestingly, recently the Red Cross did a study that essentially said that young people are concerned about nuclear weapons, but they don't consider it something that they have to work on. And I think that's really interesting, because to me, it says that young people don't feel any agency over changing this issue. So I think one thing that has worked really well for us is really showing the ways that we can make a difference, making things accessible. So, like I mentioned in my presentation, if you only have the time to write your representative, that's totally fine. That's great. I will take that over you doing nothing. But we've done we're really trying to do some more interesting and creative campaigns that appeal to younger people. One thing we did recently is something we call the voicemail ambush, because I don't know about y'all, but I don't always love making phone calls to people. So we encouraged our volunteers to call offices Friday night or Saturday afternoon after they had closed. So Monday morning when staff came in, they had a bunch of voicemails for people talking about nuclear weapons issues. So just kind of doing those things where we're meeting people where they are and trying to give them opportunities that they find interesting, and not too terrifying, I guess is the best way to put it. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I think that's terrific. I've never heard of the voicemail ambush before, but I think it's a great idea. And as a person who hates to talk on the telephone myself, that's something I'd be very cheerfully happy to do. I see there's a question here from Greg Corning. I understand Senator Lujan of New Mexico is working on renewing and expanding RICA, who's doing liaison with his staff. Here in Santa Fe, we have a close working relationship with Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety and Nuke Watch New Mexico, and we will be working with Senator Lujan's staff. We've already tried to set up an appointment with our congressional representative, Teresa Leger Fernandez, the Alliance working together, and we will be moving forward on that. And Satbir Kaur had a question for Helen in the chat. I don't know if Helen could see them there or not. Satbir, could you repeat it in the chat?
Oh, yeah, I get it. Okay, so yeah, Satbir is talking about the scholarship funded by the Tucson chapter to get the students there for the Peace Action Camp in 2017. And it says, would it be a good idea to continue and seek national scholarship funding from VFP National? We don't have planned a Peace Action Camp for the future. But if somebody thinks that they want to try and help organize that, I'd be happy to talk about it.
And Tristan, you mentioned when you were responding to my question about the fellowship program, you mentioned a stipend, but it flew by so quickly that some people might have caught it. I think it's pretty remarkable that you have a program that actually pays people to learn how to become activists.
Yeah, and just on that point, so we do offer the stipend of $1,000. So it works out to about $15 an hour. But the reason that we do that is because, kind of like you mentioned, Ken, we have that blog post on our website called Pale, Male, and Stale that just went up But what we were finding is, the only people who can afford to do unpaid internship programs are a lot of the people that we see in the space already. And we weren't getting applications from, women of color and Indigenous folks and people in rural communities. And so by offering that stipend, we've been able to have, like one of our fellows is a mom of 3. We've had students and high school students and college students and people who never went to school. So to me, it's all about making it a little bit more accessible to get involved.
Great. And Alan, I noticed that Ed Markey is one of the leaders in the parliamentarians group. Are there other American parliamentarians involved?
Sorry, I was just answering a couple of other questions in the chat while you were speaking. Some people had asked about the corporations that are involved in the nuclear weapons industry. So I put in the chat the link to the list of corporations that we've posted on Move the Nuclear Weapons Money website. And some information about those corporations. Don't Bank on the Bomb has also done some work on the corporations. And Don't Bank on the Bomb has a little bit more details on the corporations, but for some reason they don't include the Russian ones, whereas we include the Russian ones on ours. I think that might be because not many people in the United States are investing in Russian companies anyway, at least not on the New York Stock Exchange. So maybe that's why Don't Bank on the Bomb hasn't included the Russian ones, but we're Move the Nuclear Weapons Money is sort of pretty global on that. Yeah, with regards to US legislators, Senator Markey is our co-president. He's the leading one, but another quite active member who's quite interesting is Eleanor Holmes Norton. And Eleanor Holmes Norton is from Washington, DC. So she has an interesting position of having a seat in the House of Representatives, but not allowed to vote. Because DC is a district that doesn't have a vote. I don't quite understand this, being a non-American. Maybe you Americans understand a little bit better why there's a part of the United States that doesn't have a vote in the Congress. I think that's also true of some other places like Puerto Rico and some other territories of the United States. But anyway, there are some others as well. Senator Markey is probably the most active of our PND members.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Eleanor Holmes Norton because I was about to mention that one other piece of legislation currently before the Congress is H.R. 3850, which Ms. Norton has introduced every year since 1994 in one form or another. And it requires the United States to sign and ratify international agreement to disable and dismantle America's nuclear weapons, to provide for strict control of fissile material and radioactive waste, and to use nuclear-free energy.
Again, if you don't mind, I'd just like to say a little bit more about that, because I think what Eleanor Holmes Norton is putting forward is actually really important, because she talks about not just prohibiting the nuclear weapons, which is one part of the legislation, but economic conversion, which is the other part. Now, what does that mean? That means that you're actually looking at the jobs of the workers in the nuclear industry and trying to come up with ways that those jobs are protected. That's really, really important, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to get the unions on side in nuclear disarmament. But the other part of it, and that's a tricky one, is how do you actually engage the corporations in economic conversion? And they don't want to, because they have a really sweet deal. In the nuclear weapons industry, basically they can overcharge the government. It's really not that competitive. I mean, there's 27 companies in the world that are engaged in this, and they're basically helping each other to sort of keep huge amounts of money coming into their pockets. So moving them is going to be more difficult, but it has to be done, because at the moment they have a considerable political clout, which is why when Senator Markey puts forward his SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure, which you think would be obvious, he's not even calling for total elimination of nuclear weapons. He's just saying we could cut back the number of nuclear weapons and still have enough if we want nuclear deterrence. He can't even get half the Democrats on board Why? Because the nuclear weapons corporations are actually very powerful because they've spread out the production facilities in so many different districts around the United States. So I think Eleanor Holmes Norton has put forward something which is important. It needs to be advanced further. The unions is one part of it, but the corporations is another. And you, even though they're bad in some ways, you don't give up on the corporations because they're not inherently evil. I mean, it's just that they're doing this because their main motive is to make money. But if they can make money out of doing better things, and we can convince them that's a better thing to do, they will shift. You know, General Electric did that with nuclear weapons. You know, they were the biggest nuclear weapons producer, and then there was a big boycott of GE in the late 1980s, run by INFACT, and it actually moved General Electric to sell off its nuclear weapons, the part of its industry. So it is possible to shift corporations. We shouldn't give up on them. We can work with our colleagues who may have shares and go to shareholder meetings and shift them along. Do the carrot and the stick approach, you know, put forward positive programs that can help economic conversion and say, but we're going to boycott you until you shift. We're going to, stop investing in you. I think you can shift the corporations to some degree if you combine those approaches. And Eleanor Holmes Norton is putting forward these ideas in Congress.
Well, of course, what you've just said about nuclear weapons applies to the whole military-industrial complex. And the power, as my friend Ray McGovern says, the Mickey Mouse, the military, industrial, congressional, academic, media, intelligence, technology complex. And that's what we have to struggle against. The good thing is that we're not likely to be unemployed, certainly not in my lifetime, because it's going to be a long, long struggle, but one that we've got to keep at. And I see we're reaching the bottom of the hour. Were there any other questions that popped up in the chat that we've missed? Or let's see, I'll check the Q&A one more time. No, I think that pretty well covers it. And thanks again to the panelists for a wonderful job. And I hope you'll stay tuned for the rest of the convention. Thanks again to Colleen for doing a fabulous job dropping all the necessary citations into the chat so people can link to the various related items that have been mentioned. And once again, thank you all, and I hope you continue to enjoy the convention.
Thanks, Ken. And just to remind people before they go, if they want to keep all what's written in the chat, they can, anyone who's on this can save the chat by going to the 3 dots at the bottom of the chat, clicking on that and press save the chat. And that way you keep all the addresses and links and stuff that have been shared in the chat box.
Thank you for that, Alan. And any other final comments from you, Tristan?
No, I just really appreciate everyone sticking through this with us. I know virtual conferences can get overwhelming and you get a little burnt out, but I really appreciate everyone being here.
Thank you. Ellen, anything more from you?
No nukes.
No nukes. Very good. Hope to see many more of you joining the working group. And bye-bye for now.